idea of napping is important. I mean, it's a real need. So yeah, let me call Jimmy Johns and we'll work it. The next week is fast. So
I have heard, yes.
yes, I like to push the order. I'm at the Abbott Graduate School. Yes. Yeah, I'm actually in the lobby, so at the top of the steps to the left. Andre? Yep. Can I have turkey time? No,
Yeah, I was gonna use this like moving. If you have your whole life, you miss it.
a person
Mhm. I don't know. It's so many vehicles right now. I'm like, do that with my husband and money and you know how it goes. Very good. I knew it.
that's back. What's going on, man? I told you, super fast. Hey, let's make the phone with that. After studies, we can and go and stuff. So this, so first of all, how many folks have been to a cultural competence training before, someplace else, or we've had that conversation? Okay, so in the conversation of cultural competence, what is the heck? What has been your experience, and what do those words mean for you? What do you think those words mean? Cultural competence. Okay, so understanding differences and how people relate. But okay, keep going, and then come back to that in just a second.
Yeah.
Other words. Okay, so how you experience things is very different. Other folks, cultural competence. What do you mean by that? Okay. So what would be the difference then? Do you think it's a difference of nuance, or is it an actual difference between this concept of cultural competence and diversity training? What would be the difference, or is there a difference? You think they're similar? Okay. What do you think?
I think the cultural competency is important. Training what different things might mean in different lessons, so it just be more like, this is a more practical steps, I think. Like eye contact might mean something different. Using concepts and what different things might mean so that you can navigate that and not read things.
Okay, so not reading things the wrong way, being competent in understanding where other people are coming from. Okay, cool. The reason I ask, or the reason I start off with that as the central question, is because having an understanding of that, and then answering the question, why do we need 2.0, right? So it's more than just a fancy way to get people to come and have a conversation, but that's important. So how do you know that someone is competent in something? How do you know that someone is competent? Okay, so applying a skill that you've developed, right? Applying a skill that you've developed. Use it, if we can use that as kind of the baseline of even having a conversation about cultural competence. Are there skills that you have not mastered? Yeah. So what are some examples of skills that you've not mastered? Well, she said, "Oh no!" Well, just give me one. Just give me one. Okay, so finances, right? So being able to balance your finances, being able to acquire finances, right? Is certainly a skill. Anyone play the piano? Anyone ever want to play the piano? I want to play. That's not a skill that I've mastered, right? Um, and why is it that if we use the case of a piano, and so we have two people who can play the piano, and many of us who can't, why is it that I might not have developed the skill to play the piano? So A, I didn't practice, right? What else? So I may have had assumptions about the piano, or a worldview about a piano that may or may not be true, but it didn't lead me to that, to that. What else? Yeah, maybe I didn't have the transportation, the finances to get that. So there are lots of things that may have impeded my willingness to master that particular skill. Right? So when we talk about this idea of cultural competence, one of the things that we have to recognize, and I hesitate in saying this, but at the same time I want us to recognize this, that there will be cultures that we won't get a chance to master. There will be experiences that we won't get a chance to see or understand. However, although I cannot play the piano, and I am thoroughly impressed when I see someone who's been able to master the combination of those black and white keys and make music out of that, I can appreciate that. I can also value the effort that it took for them to make that happen for themselves, right? The research. So I can have an appreciation, a sincere appreciation for the work that people put into those things. So when we talk about this idea of cultural competence, we have to take those things into account. that I can't blame myself. I can't be sad about things that I won't know about. So I love watching YouTube videos, and one of my favorite websites is Pinterest, because Pinterest has all of these cool things that I think I was like, wow, I could do that. But you know what my second favorite site is? Pinterest fails. Right? Because it's just as fun to see people who had the same idea that I had. I can do that too. And they try it, and then they post it. Okay? And so those are important concepts to take into this discussion about cultural competence. So we won't know about all cultures, and we can't know. However, we should be competent enough to recognize that it took a great amount it took some ingenuity, and it took some purpose in that culture developing the way that it did. Even if I don't agree with be able with an author and respect. So that leads us to this idea of cultural competence. So as always, I start off with these principles that I think should be the basis of any interaction that we have with other human beings, and that's understanding kind of where they come from. So if you open up to the center, or the 14, can learn, change, grow, the evidence of it. So to be true. Think about a behavior that you had in your own life that adults wish that you on your time. People do what they think works, even when what? Even when people do something, they're not getting any benefit from it. I think that is. Why do they keep doing things that don't work or don't benefit them or don't help them achieve their goal? So, okay, so it can be interwoven into the habits and the culture that they come from. What else? It's what they know how to do. Fear of the unknown. So it's passed down from, right? So their parents did it, their grandparents did it. But why? All of those are valid rationales. But what is either the starting point or the end point of that behavior? Why? Why that particular behavior? Or that particular set of behaviors? What about the goal? Uh-huh. Yeah. But why do you continue to pull things into that belief if it doesn't make sense, particularly to other people? Why do you keep doing it? What is the drive for that? You hope that it still does something, which implies that at some point it what? It did do something, right? So at some point this behavior was effective and it got me something that was successful, but now something has changed. So, falling out in a big department store may have worked as a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, but now I'm 47. Can you see me falling out throwing a tantrum? Maybe. Right? So I use that behavior because I thought it was effective, and it may not necessarily have been effective when I was 2, but it's certainly not effective at 47. Why? Because I'm expected to mature, because the context is different, right? There are things that we allow that 2-year-olds to do that we would expect adults to not do, right? My 2-year-old right now, she's in this thing where she gets really frustrated and she does one of two things. She either covers her eyes, not sure what that's about, or she bites. Right? Those are the two things she's like, and I'm like, whoa, sister. We have Great Danes. You don't want to do that, right? So, yeah, human beings can learn, change, and grow even when we don't see evidence of it. We know that people do what they think works. What's going on there? Even when it doesn't. I got 4 sandwiches, so and 5 people, so I'm gonna have to arm up sandwiches. And then this is. Yeah, so I have, so like a veggie, which is this. And Turkey Tom, what was the cut in half? This was the individual outfits. So, look at it, I you know what? Oh, okay. I'll let you do the honor on this. And then I also have bagels and other stuff, and I have another veggie. This game.
No, it's okay. I was late, so.
Okay, I have, yeah, and I apologize for that. So, so, so there's this. And then all human behavior is goal-directed, right? So one of the things we have to ask ourselves when we see behaviors or when we see people interacting is, what is the goal of that behavior? If we can pay attention to what the goal of the behavior is, then the behavior itself doesn't seem so bizarre or inappropriate, right? Even if we don't understand the behavior. But if we can ask, what is the goal of this particular behavior? That can be more helpful to us oftentimes than being caught up by the behavior itself. We also need to recognize that attitudes are side effects of goal accomplishment. Oftentimes, we have been taught that that an attitude is a particular thing. And I believe, in terms of layman's interactions, that may work, but as practitioners, we need to recognize that attitudes are the result of goal accomplishment. When people reach their goals, they have a good attitude. When they don't reach their goal, they have a bad attitude. And so that concept of attitude, again, gets us out of being so concerned with the particular attitude, that gets us back to goal attainment, right? One of the things that I remember as a kid was that I would try to get my parents off track because I would talk back, and that was a no-no in my house. But my talking back was a tool I was using to sidetrack our conversation. In Adlerian terms, we refer to that as a sideshow, right? So I want to have this emotional outburst or do something that I know that I can trigger someone else so that we don't have to deal with my behaviors, but we can actually talk about someone else's behaviors. You'll see that a lot of times, particularly when we have conversations about cultural competence versus diversity training or sensitivity training. Sometimes the feelings and emotions are so high that people really want to check out of the conversation, or they haven't confronted a lot of these conversations. And so you'll see emotions well up in individuals, and oftentimes people will cry. And we know that tears are a good way to heal, to release, to express oneself. But sometimes they can also be used as a tool to hijack a conversation. So we're no longer talking about the conversation, but now we're talking about you and why you're crying or whatever your emotional outburst is. The same can be held with anger, with defiance or distrust of a facilitator. Oftentimes, it can be a tool that people use to sidetrack the conversation, and so that's something that we have to note. And so one of the things I'll offer you that I am trying to get to in this particular conversation is this idea of cultural competence 2.0, which one of the things that I've learned in my engagement, both when I taught some cultural competence trainings, 1.0 kinds of trainings, um, or attended some of those trainings, is that they spent a great deal of time talking about differences that people had. And so when you interact with this culture, keep this in mind. When you interact with this culture, here are the 5 things you need to know about that. And what I found was that people had that information, and they would say things like, "I don't want to be. I know I won't be politically correct on this because I don't know about what these people are called." Or people would say things like, "I'm not." Well, so people would not do those things. Here's a good example of how some of those trainings didn't work. People would get the skill to say, when you interact, and I'll use this as a kind of obscure, obtuse, extreme example. When you meet native people, don't make eye contact, but you bow. Right? It's not real. I'm just making this up. So what people would do is when they saw folks who they thought were native, not make eye contact, and then they bow, and then the person they're talking to is like, what are you doing?" Right? So they would take these things out of context, and we also recognize that some things are would be stereotypical of a group versus being a generalization of a group. And we'll talk about the difference between those in just a second. So this idea of cultural competence 2.0 is going a bit beyond talking about the things that make us different, because, as they say in Star Wars, we need to bring balance to the Force, right? And I oftentimes get that confused because I watch. I don't know if you've watched all the films, but I've watched all the films. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that the hero would live long enough to turn into the villain. So the question for me was, if he turned out to be the villain, was he the villain in the beginning? And if he was the villain in the beginning, or if he's the hero and he's the villain now, is it possible that there's still some hero attributes in this villain? And so I was watching a couple of YouTube videos, and they were talking about this idea of bringing balance to the Force. And what they suggested is that the balance of the Force is very similar to kind of the yin and yang symbol. I'm not sure if you've seen those two interwoven pieces, but in the darkness, there is light. And in the light, there is also darkness. And so when we talk about cultural competence, and we talk too often, we've talked about the differences or the contrast, but we've not talked about what is that balance between all of those things. Is there good in me, or is there bad in me? Yes. Right? And so in this idea of cultural competence 2.0, I want to spend less time talking about what those differences are. I want to spend some time talking about those commonalities, but more importantly, we have to talk about the context by which cultures are created. Because just like other human behaviors, cultures have number 3. Cultures have what? They have purpose. They are goal-oriented, right? And typically the goal of a culture is to do what? It's the goal of a cultural group. To hold a value. What else? What's that? Maintain the culture, and maintain it for what purpose? What's that? So to function as a community. Yes, to spread it, right? To reproduce the culture. Why? Because they have found some things that they believe have been effective, so they need to and want to pass those things on. Right? So when we talk about context, we have to take some time and look at the American context. I've lived in other places, but I've never been a citizen of other places. And I have to say that my living in other places, I would consider myself to be a visitor, a tourist, a vacationer, but never a person who actually was able to live in that culture. So I can't speak to what other cultures or other nation states do as well as I can what the United States does. And so when we talk about this idea of um, context, it becomes important to recognize that we come from a particular context. And the context that sets the tone for everything that we do in the United States comes directly from the Constitution of the United States. All right? And the subsequent Bill of Rights. Now, one of the things that you may want to consider is doing some research on this idea of critical race theory. Has anyone ever heard of critical race theory? So critical race theory is a way of talking about these diverse concepts that take into account these three things. They take into account the notion of race. So what is race? What are the legal ramifications that set up this idea of race? And then thirdly, what are the powers that enforce those other two principles, right? So critical race theory. And so in the preamble to the Constitution, we have some very wonderful and eloquently written words about what is ordained and established for this great country. The Declaration of Independence said, hey, these are some things that we stand for as a country. In England, you can take your job and shove it. I'm not working for you no more, right? Do you guys remember that song? Okay, anyway. So that was the tenor. But we also know that there were some very severe failings that we had as those words were being penned, right? What was one of the largest failings that occurred while the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are being drafted? What economic system are we engaging in as this is happening? As a country, what were we engaged in 1776? The slave trade, right? The transatlantic slave trade. So we're penning these great words while we're still importing people as things, right? So we're still importing people as things. So there's that. Simultaneously, while we're doing that, what else are we doing? There's one more thing that we're doing while we're penning these things. So we're importing people in the economic system of slavery. What else are we doing? So we're revolting against England. Yeah, we're pushing Native Americans out of their lands, right? So this becomes the beginning of the relationship that we then later, because we even talk about racial groups in the beginning, but later we talk about this idea of racial groups. And so, anyone been on a first date with someone? A first date? Okay, cool. Can you imagine if that person lied to you about everything on the first date? Do you think that there would have been a second date? No. Right? Why? Because you can't trust this person.
How do I know that they're ever going to?
So how do you know that they're ever going to tell the truth, be trustworthy, pick me up in an emergency, follow through on what they say? This is the incubation conversation of the United States. So when you hear, Black Lives Matter, or you hear Justice for All, which is trying to get the felonies repealed so that people can actually live a life outside of an oppressive system. These are the questions that they have based on how we started. Right? So we started out on a bad date. Now, we've been trying to make it up as we've gone along, but there's certainly some obstacles. So 1830 is the Indian Removal Act by President Andrew Jackson. Hi, come on in. And